Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. The Quranic perspective on apostasy, slavery and concubines. Translation of Kital-e Murtad, Ghulam or Lundian. Ghulam Ahmed Parwez. Talui Islam Trust Registered. 25B, Gulberg 2, Lahore. Two Slaves and Concubines. If you listen to an address on the truthfulness and reality of Islam from the platform of any mosque, you will always hear these grand and lofty claims that Islam has bestowed religious freedom. Islam has erased every sign and remnant of slavery from the world. It is a fact that these claims of our speakers and reformers contain great truth, but together with this, it is also a fact that they are also based on an equally great lie. You will obviously be astounded at how it is that we have written such contradictory things. But this contradiction does, in reality, exist, and it contains thousands of chronicles of instruction and lessons in it for every discerning mind. Undoubtedly, Islam provided religious freedom to mankind and removed any sign of slavery from the world. Hence, Islam has earned this right that it can present as lofty a claim as it wishes in front of the world, and in this regard, it has conferred a supreme favor on mankind. But which Islam? That Islam which was sent down by Allah, which Rasulullah passed on to the world, and which even today is preserved and present within the folds of the Quran. This is the certification for the supreme truth of these claims. But if these claims are put forward from the direction of the scholars of Shariat regarding the Islam which they present, then they are, in fact, based on a tremendous lie. This is because Islam has neither given religious freedom, nor has eliminated slavery. How this Islam has strangled the throat of religious freedom, you have seen a picture of this under the topic of Kital-e Murtad. In the chapter under view, take note of what the opinion is of that Islam regarding slavery, which was concocted by Ajami intrigues, and which the mullah, by connecting it to Allah and his Rasul, is becoming a cause for the defamation of Islam and the humiliation of mankind. 2.1 Teaching of Quranic Islam. First, let us see what the teaching is of the Islam of the Quran in this respect. At the time when Rasulullah became a Nabi, slavery was also prevalent as an established fact, just like Malukiyat, priesthood, capitalism, racism, and nationalism. Leaving the tyrannical kings to one side, the state of worldly scholars was such that Aristotle had 70 slaves, and he used to present 70 reasons to justify slavery. In Arabia, slaves and concubines had become an intrinsic part of their society. Slaves used to work outdoors while inside the homes concubines were employed for sexual gratification. This same practice had been continuing among them for centuries. Hence, as has been written above, slaves and concubines had become a part of their society, and the greater part of their economic life was dependent on this. The Quran had come to break these chains and bonds in which mankind was continuously being gripped. Obviously, how could it have allowed the worst of curses like these chains of slavery? The message of the Quran is a message about the eminence of humanity, and its invitation is an invitation to the dignity of humanity. The proclamation of Allah of the Quran is, "Surely, we have honored the children of Adam." 17:70. This means that man as a human being is deserving of respect. His being a human being is a cause for eminence, and this eminence and respect is for every child of Adam. All of mankind has been created from a single cell. 4:1. And divine energy, Ruh, has been breathed into every human being. In other words, every human being is a holder of the potentialities of these divine attributes. And the purpose and meaning of a Quranic society is only this, that by manifesting these potential attributes they should be completely developed. It is self-evident that in the deen in which this is the fundamental teaching about man, human slavery cannot even be envisaged. 2.22 Stages were in front of the Quran. There were two important questions before the Quran. At the time of the revelation of the Quran, to provide a route for the emancipation of those slaves and concubines who had become a part of the social and economic life of the Arabs and in other countries. And For the future, to shut the gate through which slaves and concubines used to enter. Regarding the first point, it is obvious that all of these slaves and concubines could not be made to disappear in one day. The objective of Islam was that by giving them freedom, to make them stand side by side with the rest of humanity, but in the social and economic circumstances which are mentioned above, this aim could only be achieved gradually. If all of these slaves and concubines, who were present at that time, had been freed and released immediately, then not only would a severe disruption have taken place in that society, but even for these slaves and concubines themselves there would have been untold hardships. And more often than not, they would not even have wished to abandon those families with whom they were well adjusted. The Quran adopted such a practical technique regarding them, through which they became absorbed by degrees into free society. They were given the right that if they wished, then by paying some compensation, they could achieve permission to be free. At other places, Muslims themselves were instructed to set slaves free as an atonement for some of their errors. Similarly, concubines were gradually accorded the status of free women. Until such a time that these slaves and concubines had not been gradually absorbed, the command was given to treat them well so that they are not deprived of human conveniences. Whatever instructions there are in the Quran regarding slaves and concubines, they are all related to those who existed at that time in that society in the position of slaves and concubines. Wherever they are mentioned in the Quran, it is in these words ma malakat aymanukum, those possessed by your right hands, who have come as slaves and concubines into your ownership. Nowhere as those whom you make after this as slaves and concubines. This was regarding the first point, i.e. about those concubines and slaves who were present in the society of the Arabs at the advent of Islam. 2.3 The door is closed for the future. Now let us address the second point, i.e. closing the door on slavery for all time to come. For this, the Quran has given a command so unequivocally that there is no room remaining for any doubt or suspicion whatsoever. And what command is there of the Quran in which there can be room for doubt and suspicion, provided that it is viewed with an open mind and without any preconceived ideas? It is our spectacles colored by orthodoxy which make its clear and transparent teaching tainted. During the era of ignorance, prisoners of war were made into slaves and concubines, and would also afterwards be sold. Sometimes children were also kidnapped and then sold, but the true source of slaves and concubines was prisoners of war. What should be done with prisoners of war is described in Surah Muhammad. When you have a confrontation with the kuffar, then bring them under the control of the sword until they no longer retain the force to confront you. Their power is dissipated. Then tie up the rest of the force. 47. 4. This is about the prisoners of war. After this it is decreed that these prisoners of war should be either to be released in kindness as a favor or in return for compensation. Fidya. 47. 4. This is the only command concerning prisoners of war in the whole of the Quran. Study this instruction, and then contemplate whether any possibility can arise from any aspect whatsoever to make them into slaves. Or can there even be a glimmer of the thought that the wish of the Quran is for Muslims to make prisoners of war into slaves, have sexual relations with their women, and then to sell them like a flock of sheep when you wish? After being sold, they become the slaves of the new buyer. And concubines fall into their use, and until the day of judgment, unless their owners set them free, generation after generation, they remain as slaves and deprived of every manner of human rights. The son of a slave remains a slave and will never become the owner of a single coin all his life, even if he becomes a Muslim. Just reflect whether this command can be deduced in any way at all from the verse quoted above. The command of the Quran is crystal clear. If there is a war with the enemy, then in that situation captives of war will fall into your hands. These will be prisoners of war. While there is a war situation, they will be kept imprisoned. After this, the question of their disposal will arise before you, which is why the Quran has presented two alternatives for this i.e. either to accept compensation, in which exchange for your own prisoners is also included, or these prisoners should be released as a favor. Ihsan. The Quran has neither given the command to kill them nor to make them into slaves. 2.4 The religion of the mullah. But the shariat of the mullah says no. This command of Allah is incomplete. Its completion is through that Islam which I put forward, and that command is that those people who are prisoners in a war should either be released as an act of kindness or should be released in return for compensation, or they should be exchanged for Muslim prisoners. But if simply releasing them is against the circumstances of the war, and compensation cannot be received, and the enemy is also not agreeable to exchange prisoners of war, then Muslims have the right to keep them as slaves. In his tafsir, Maududi writes with even greater elaboration that this matter resides within the authority of the government, that it can adopt whatever option it chooses. The government has the authority that, if it wishes, it can release them. Women captured in a war. If it wishes, it can take compensation from them. If it wishes, it can exchange them with those Muslim prisoners of war who are in the hands of the enemy. And if it wishes, it can distribute them among the soldiers so that the soldiers can make use of them. This means that the command of Allah is only to the extent that prisoners of war are to be released either as an act of kindness, or by the taking of some compensation or return. But Maududi informs us that Allah forbid. This command of Allah is flawed. The full command is like this. If it is wished, prisoners of war are to be released as an act of kindness. Or if it is wished, release them after taking compensation, and if it is wished, make them slaves and keep them, and bring their women into your own use. The truth is that the whole foundation of the religion of the mullah is based on this belief that no command of Allah is ever complete. Its completion occurs through other sources. As a consequence, Maududi writes very frankly in this regard that the true cause of the error of the writer is that he has tried to deduce the law of slavery exclusively from the Quran. What doubt is there in that? What greater error can there be by a Muslim than that he views the Quran as a complete code of life and makes efforts to derive the laws of life from it? This is not merely an error, but in the court of the mullah it is such a supreme crime, in recompense for which such a Muslim can be consigned to the gallows by declaring him to be a Murtad. To be a Muslim and to be attempting to derive laws purely from the Quran. Tawbah! Tawbah! What an immense accusation against Allah, and what immense audacity against the Quran. Who knows what answer such Muslims will give when they go before Allah, when He will ask them, "Did you consider my book to be the complete code of law? Did you entertain such a suspicion about me, whether I could give complete instructions? Did you indeed take this decree of mine to be the truth, that the laws of your Rabb have reached their completion with truth and justice? No one can change these divine laws." 6. 115. Did the holders, mullahs, of the secrets of Shariat not repeatedly tell you that the commands of Allah are flawed and in need of non-Allah additions for their completion? You remained stubborn on your stance and did not accept a single thing of theirs. Now speak, what answer do you have for this? In the mind of the mullah, the image of Allah is something very much like this. 2.5 A contradictory narrative. This was the extent to which Maududi had written in reply to Hafiz Aslam Jarajpuri. But when someone quizzed him directly that having sex with concubines without nikah is sexual perversion and Islam is against this, he wrote in reply that, before answering these questions, it should be known that, based on the right of ownership, permission for Mata 111 is clearly revealed in the Quran in numerous verses. Many people raise objections in this matter with great bluntness, thinking that perhaps this is a ploy concocted by Malvis. And some deniers of a hadith, considering this to be from among the nonsense of a hadith, begin to be excessively vocal. Therefore, all these people should remain aware that their issue is not with the fiqh of the Malvis and the ahadith of the Muhaddithin, rather it is with the Book of Allah Himself. First of all, Look at this statement in which Maududi has said that the true cause of the error of the writer is this, that he has tried to deduce the law of slavery exclusively from the Quran. And now it is being said that whatever I say is not an issue concocted by Maulvi himself, it is the command of the Quran itself. Just reflect how great a game it is that is being played with deen, i.e. when it suits, to then say that deen is not only present in the Quran, along with this fiqh and a hadith are also essential. And when it feels the need, to then say that we do not quote authorities from fiqh and a hadith, we present the Quran. After this, Maududi has copied those verses of the Quran which are about those slaves and concubines who existed at the time of the revelation of the Quran and which have been referred to above. Quoting the Quranic verse pertaining to prisoners of war, Allama Aslam Jarajpuri had written that nowhere in it could any permission be found about making prisoners into slaves. The translation of the verse was as follows. Then either release them through mana, ihsan, as a gesture of generosity, or by taking fidya. 47. 4. About this translation, Maududi states. After this the word mana is in need of deliberation. The meaning of mana is only ihsan. Free them through ihsan is an addition of the translator. But at another place, Maududi himself writes that this happens to be the law of Islam, that people who are captured during war should either be released as an ihsan. And at another place, Islam presented this principle before the world that regarding those people who are made prisoners in war, take fidya from them and free them, or exchange them as prisoners of war, or release them as a way of ihsan. In other words, if Allama Aslam Jarajpuri states release them as an ihsan, then this is an addition from his own direction, it is not the law of Islam. And when Maududi declares release them through ihsan, then this is a law of Islam, and is not an addition from his own direction. 2.6 The command of ihsan is not in the Quran. In this connection another very interesting matter also comes before us. Maududi states that the word mana is in the verse, which means to have ihsan, and nowhere in the Quran is the command for ihsan given. Have you observed to what extent the mullah is prepared to go in order to support his own stance? He states that the command for ihsan is not given anywhere in the Quran. This is about that Quran in which this verse also exists. In Allah yamuru bil adali wal ihsan. 16. 90. Surely, Allah commands you to do adal and ihsan. 16. 90. From this you can ascertain how great an ihsan this is of Allah's, that he has taken responsibility for the protection of the Quran upon himself. Otherwise that mullah whose state of audacities is such that despite the existence of such commands in the Quran, he declares that no command of ihsan has been given anywhere in the Quran. If the Quran had been within his jurisdiction, then who knows what he would have done to it. 2.7 How does the world solve this issue? Maududi repeatedly comes out with this. That if the opposing party does not get their prisoners freed, and the prisoners do not have any means for payment of fidya, then in that event what should be done to these prisoners? But what we ask is this, whether there is no other answer to this question than that they should be made slaves and their women should begin to be used. There are wars in the world every other day, prisoners are also captured in these wars, problems also arise relating to these prisoners. In front of our very own eyes, two dreadful great wars have taken place in which the total number of captives reached tens of millions. Did the mind of any among these nations consider this aspect, that by making these prisoners slaves and their women concubines, they should be sold for pennies among men? The minds of these kuffar and mushrikeen did not venture in this direction, but when this same question appears before these muftis of Shariat of ours, whose claim is that our system of life is not one devised by men but is bestowed by Allah himself, and there is no example or model like it seen anywhere in the world, then they cannot see any practical option other than that these prisoners should be made slaves and sold, and their women should be taken possession of for their personal use. The Quran provides a clear solution to this problem. It states that until such time that your situation demands, keep these prisoners as prisoners, and since these prisoners are human beings, therefore treat them with humaneness. After this, when the question arises of freeing them, then you are permitted to have your men who have been captured, released in exchange for them. Or if the opposing party does not hold your prisoners, or they are fewer in number, then free them after taking payment in fidya, and it is also permitted to release them as an ihsan. Whichever situation appears suitable, act accordingly, right up until the war itself lays down its weapons. 47. 4. I.e. Your objective should be that the issue of war should end from the world. One link in this process is also this, that you treat these prisoners of war in such a way that in the future they do not even lift up weapons in opposition to you, and behave towards the opposing nations in such a way of ihsan, that their heads become bowed before you automatically. This was the will of the Quran. But the religion of our mullah is that prisoners of war should be made into slaves and their women should be made use of for sexual gratification, so that war becomes eliminated from the world. Very true. Since people who are treated in this way will never be able to incline towards enmity in the future, as they will become the unpaid slaves of such a nation. Since the very concept of slavery is such that man's sense of humanity is hurt by this. Provided that this feeling is not paralyzed by the drug-like influence of blind obedience or veiled due to vested interests. Hence, in this regard many objections against this reached Maududi. On seeing these objections, Maududi argues. Today, people are experiencing difficulties in understanding these laws which Islam had formulated regarding the rights of prisoners, concubines and slaves captured in war, because the circumstances of that era no longer exist today for which these laws were formulated. From this excerpt it appears as if Maududi is saying the same thing which we presented at the beginning, i.e. that the instructions in the Quran regarding what their right hands possess are about those concubines and slaves who existed at that time in Arab society. When those slaves no longer remained, then those instructions also finished. Although, if after this a similar situation arises again, i.e. some nation accepts Islam in which concubines and slaves are already in existence, or even those nations of Muslims themselves in which concubines and slaves used to be kept, or are even today continuing to be kept, e.g. the Holy Land of Hejaz, and in the pure Islamic government there 119, then they should turn towards the Quran again. And then the same instructions will again become applicable which used to be implemented during the time of Rasulullah. 2.8 These commands are still applicable. But Maududi is actually saying something quite different from this. He is saying that even today prisoners of war can be made into slaves and their women into concubines. Consequently, after the creation of Pakistan, when Maududi was demanding the implementation of the system of Shariat, he was asked in 1948, will there be permission to make prisoners of war slaves and concubines under the system of Shariat, and will there be a right to sell these slaves and concubines? And he replied, yes. This has been permitted under the system of Shariat. After this, he described those circumstances in which prisoners of war can be made into slaves and presented those justifications according to which these instructions are absolutely based on wisdom. As per Maududi. If anyone has any doubt, then he can again inquire of Maududi whether in the system of Shariat which he wishes to establish, there will be permission to make prisoners of war into slaves and their women into concubines or not. His tafsir, Tafhim al-Quran, has been recently published. In it, the command to make women captured during war into concubines and to then be distributed among the soldiers is permanently included. An excerpt has been given above, whoever wishes its detail, can see it there. And this is because, in the concocted Shariat of the royal courts during the era of the Middle Ages, what was the point of a society in which there were no concubines? 2.9 Arguments in favor of slavery. Now examine those arguments according to which Slavery is being declared to be fully in accordance with divine wisdom. He states, in the system of Shariat, permission for making prisoners of war into slaves and concubines has been given in that situation when a nation with whom we are at war is neither agreeable to the exchange of prisoners, nor on accepting fidya to release our prisoners, and nor by giving fidya, to release its own prisoners. If you ponder on it, then you can understand that in this situation those prisoners who are left remaining with the government will either be killed by it, or will be kept in those kinds of human containment areas which are nowadays called concentration camps. And it will continue to obtain forced labor from them without giving them any kind of human rights. It is obvious that this situation is far more merciless. The model which Islam has adopted for such circumstances is that these prisoners should be distributed individually among Muslims and their status in law should be defined. The question is not what any government may do with the prisoners of war in these circumstances, the question is this: what will the government responsible for the system of Islamic Shariat do in these circumstances? Will they also possess similar concentration camps in which forced labor will be extracted without giving these prisoners any kind of human rights? In this system of Shariat will there be no obligation to treat human beings like human beings? Will there be no allowance to keep these prisoners as state guests in it? Will that system only be such a one in which prisoners of war will be grateful that they are made slaves, otherwise who knows how they would have been treated? From this it becomes obvious that in the system of Shariat such treatment will be meted out to human beings that, compared to this treatment, slavery for them will be as if it were a great ihsan. Will this be that system of Shariat about which we have been continually proclaiming to the whole world that it has descended from the heavens? Then note that instead of developing some solution to reform concentration camps and enjoining the world to treat prisoners of war as human beings, we tell them that Islam has presented the following solution to this problem: that their men should be made slaves and their women made into concubines. Subhanallah! What a descended from the heavens reformation! Humanity will be proud of this balanced treatment. And prisoners across the world will become prostrate before the supreme ihsan when they will witness in front of their eyes that their wives, daughters, sisters are becoming victims for the sexual and hedonistic pleasures of these righteous and honorable Muslims. They will be grateful that forced labor is not being extracted from them, only forcibly being subjected to. Murtad also stated that by making them slaves, their lawful status becomes established. Do you know what that lawful status is? A slave cannot be the owner of even 1 penny of his labor. The son of a slave is also a slave. So much so, that even if a non-Muslim slave becomes a Muslim, even then he remains a slave. Whenever the owner wishes, he can sell him to whoever he wishes. Sexual relations with a slave woman, i.e. concubine, are established without nikah, and in this there is no limit even on numbers. The status of a concubine with whom such sexual relations are established is not similar to that of respectable ladies, so much so, that the mark of slavery remains even on her children. Regarding sex with a concubine, withdrawal can be practiced as well as anal sex. Details and authority for this will come later. And when the desire is satiated, then the concubine can also be sold on to someone else. Have you witnessed how great this lawful status is which is being bestowed on slaves and concubines? 2.10 Supreme Ihsan on women. Murtad states that, for women captured in war, what solution can be better than that the individual into whose ownership the woman is consigned by the government should be given the lawful right to establish sexual relations with her? If this was not done, then these women would become a permanent source of spreading immorality in the country. In other words, if in a society every individual appropriates 10 or 20 women, establishes sexual relations with them against their will, and then whenever he wishes, passes them on to others, and also puts the proceeds of their sale in his own pocket, then all of this is mashallah included in those ethics which lead to purification. And if these women are not distributed among others in this way, and are neither bought and sold in this way, then they will become a cause for the spread of permanent immorality within society. What more can be said about this? Other than that every one of those immoral acts for the justification of which a fatwa can be obtained from the court of the mullah, is precisely in line with morality. Apart from this, what other definition can there be for morality and immorality? Consequently, Murtad has himself further clarified this. The following objection was raised against him. Having sexual relations with concubines without nikah is merely a sexual perversion, and Islam is against this. 2.11 No need for nikah. You have heard the objection, now look at the answer. He maintains. The aversion which is seen is merely an imagined distaste. Since minds have become habituated to the common and prevalent concept of nikah. Hence people seem to think that the only relationship which is legitimate between a man and woman is one in which a cause immediates. Two witnesses are present, and there is approved acceptance, and a khutbah of nikah is read. Any form other than this is merely debauchery. But Islam is not a conventional religion, rather it is a rational religion. It looks at the reality, not the custom. A woman who becomes halal for a man through nikah ultimately becomes halal on this basis that the law of Allah has made her halal. Similarly, if Allah's law makes her halal on the basis of Maliki Yamin, what your right hands possess, then what is so distasteful in this? Did you see? The individual raising the objection was squirming uncomfortably at having mata with concubines without nikah. Whereas according to Murtad, never mind the issue of concubines, even the original nikah is in fact unnecessary. An important question arises from this. With the agreement of the woman, Zayd establishes sexual relations with any such woman with whom a nikah can take place according to the Quran. In this way, they both live together in mutual agreement but do not do a nikah. The question is whether this sexual relationship of theirs will be legitimate or not according to Shariat, and will their progeny be declared as halal or haram. According to Murtad, these relationships are absolutely legitimate. Those people who consider such a relationship without nikah to be illegitimate according to Shariat, should go and get this matter clarified from Murtad themselves. We are discussing concubines for the present, so would like to confine our discussion to only this issue. Regarding the halal and haram nature of sex, it is extremely important to understand that every one of those women who has been declared as halal by Allah does not become halal automatically. For this, there is also another important condition, and that condition is intrinsic in the same way that the condition of halal is from the direction of Allah. And that condition is the agreement of the woman herself. For example, Allah declared the daughter of his father's younger brother as halal for Zayd. i.e. according to the Quran, the nikah of Zayd can take place with the daughter of his uncle. But this girl does not become halal for Zayd merely by Allah declaring her to be halal. For this, the agreement of the girl herself is also fundamental. That she wishes to become the wife of Zayd. If that girl does not agree to this, then, despite being made halal by Allah, she will remain haram for Zayd. Therefore, for sexual relations to be legitimate, two conditions are intrinsically linked. Firstly, this woman has been declared as halal by Allah. And secondly, this woman should be in agreement for this man and woman relationship. If even one of these conditions is not met, then those relations will be haram. And as has been noted above, if the woman does not agree, then even if declared halal by Allah, she will not become halal. Now consider, does the second condition become fulfilled in the case of a relationship with a concubine? Do sexual relations become established through the agreement of a concubine? It is obvious that the question of agreement does not even arise in this. Whoever's share she falls into and to whoever she is sold, she will, in any case, have to share a bed with him. Now just think, is there any such code of ethics in the world which will declare this kind of relationship as legitimate? Leave the code of laws of Allah on one side, have the atheists of Europe, the Kufr, and the Mushrikeen, declared these kinds of sexual relations legitimate for themselves. Even among these people these liaisons are declared to be simply rape. But it is an irony that if such liaisons are allowed, then it is with the so-called followers of this deen, which happens to be the highest trustee of ethics and the proponent of the purest chastity and honor. And the worst thing of all is that permission for these forced sexual relations is being referred to the being of Rasulullah, who was the greatest teacher and flag-bearer of purity of ethics, chaste vision, and cleansed thought and deed in the world. After this, what can a human being do other than beat his head with his hands and sit back? Just reflect to where these intrigues of Ajm have taken us, i.e. those matters which even atheists and mushrikeen consider shameful have been made into a part of our religion and have been associated with Allah and Rasulullah. 2.12 There is no defined limit. Now let us continue. When this objection was raised before Maududi that in Islamic Shariat a limit of 4 has been established for nikah, but in the case of concubines, no limit has been defined from the outset. What is the reason for this? It appears as if the benefits of the limit of 4 have been made batil by this permission. It has opened the door to limitless debauchery for wealthy people and provided an excuse for the rich and powerful to purchase countless women and ensconce them in their homes and derive great gratification from them. This is not just an assumption but what has commonly been taking place in the past history of Muslims. And in response he said, the limit of numbers for mata with concubines has not been defined because it is not possible to know the number of women who will turn up having been captured in war. Supposing that a large number of such women accumulates, what scheme can there be to absorb them into society, if the number for mata with concubines has already been defined? But if someone confronts you and queries that, in the case of married women, there is a limit of up to 4 defined among you, and the justification you present for this is that when the number of women increases they can be absorbed into society in this way. But if a situation develops in which the number of women in society increases greatly, what will you do in that eventuality? From your line of reasoning it becomes proven that in the final limit fixed by Allah regarding married women, farsightedness has not been employed. Allah forbid. Only the law of the mullah is based on farsightedness, in which no limit to the number of concubines is defined. And if, according to Maududi, the law about concubines is also made by Allah, then it is strange that in the case of married wives this was not taken into account, that if the number of women increases beyond this, what will be done, while in the matter of concubines this was specifically catered for. 2.13 Mental perversion. What holy excuses man devises to satiate his hedonistic lusts. After this, Maududi states, as far as this suspicion of yours is concerned, that by permitting mata with countless numbers of concubines, this opens the door for mental perversion. And because concubines are able to be bought and sold, there is the possibility that by purchasing many concubines, rich people will avail themselves of a large contingent and will turn their homes into an abode of perversion. These and most similar doubts usually arise for this reason, that only one aspect of the matter is before them and other aspects remain hidden. This issue should be kept well in mind, that Sharia has made his law for the welfare of mankind. And the conveniences and allowances that have been retained in this law have been kept for those real needs which are generally faced by man or could face him. If some people take these kinds of wrong advantages of these allowances, for which, in fact, Sharia had not kept these allowances, then it is a result of their lack of understanding or mischievousness of themselves. But due to fear of the possibility of such individual errors or their occurrence, creating such restrictions in the law because of which hardships can occur in meeting the real needs of the common people, cannot be the work of a hakim. In this connection he writes at another place, in the era which followed, it is obvious that the way in which the rich and elite made this tolerance in the law as an excuse for hedonism, was against the will of Shariat. It is hard to comprehend that when large numbers of concubines are pouring into the country, their numbers are also not fixed, they can also be passed to and from others, then which perversion is it that you can declare to be against the will of Shariat? If someone acquires a concubine, whether from the government or purchased, and Shariat grants permission for establishing sexual relations with her, then how could having mata with this concubine become an excuse for perversion? Firstly, providing the means for perversion yourselves, and then heaping accusations on those who derive advantage from this. Are the accused those who provide these means of perversion, or those who engage in mata with them? In this connection Maududi states that if some rich man wishes to indulge in perversion and is bent upon taking advantage of the allowance in the law, against the requirement of the law, then how can even the code of nikah become an obstacle for him? He can have a nikah with a new woman every day and can give her a divorce the next day. This circumstance is also only possible through that shariat which is the concoction of the mullah himself. According to Quranic shariat, giving a divorce is not a sport like an auction, where you say 1, 2, 3, and kick the wife out. For a Quranic divorce, after passing through many stages a decision will need to be sought through the court. This jest will not be played in it that just sitting at home, utter talak, 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 and the matter is ended. 2.14 Selling of concubines. After this Maududi responds to this objection that the selling of concubines is an extremely degrading act. He contends permission for selling these kinds of concubines and slaves is actually in the sense that an individual, until the time that fidya is received or fidya is not received by him, the right that he has to obtain service from them, he transfers that onwards to another person after receiving compensation. The reason for which this permission is kept within the law can only be fully understood if you have experienced keeping an enemy prisoner of war. It is not an easy matter to obtain service from army soldiers, and in the same way, it is not an easy matter to keep a woman of an enemy state in your household. If this provision had not been retained for an individual that he could deal with the imprisoned man or woman by transferring the rights of ownership to someone else, then into whoever's hands these people were given, they would have become a torment for him. What logic this is! In other words, it is very difficult to get work out of prisoners of an enemy, and keeping their women in your homes is fraught with danger. But when these same prisoners are made slaves, then this difficulty is made easy. And when sexual relations are established with their women against their will in front of their men, then as a result all those dangers from them are removed which could have been faced due to their being members of an enemy nation. From this, their revengeful sentiments will most certainly convert into affection. Now the state of affairs is this, that when these slaves and concubines become a problem for someone, the solution for this is that they should be sold on into the hands of another. And these marketed slaves and concubines will really become an assured source of comfort for their new owners. From this, a heartfelt affection will become forged in them. And in this way, when he sells them onwards to a third buyer, then as a result of this an even greater affection will spring up for this new master. Their enmity was actually already present from the very first one who acquired them free of cost. What shame will they have in harboring enmity towards the ones who have purchased them by handing over a sum of money? 2.15 And if non-Muslims also practice this? Now let us look at this objection. If non-Muslim warring nations dispense the same treatment to captured Muslim women, then, logically, what right do Muslims have to protest against it? In reply to this, Maududi states, as far as this final question of yours is concerned, it looks as if at the time of posing this question, you had assumed that regarding those Muslim women who are entering the custody of the enemy, they will be maintaining them literally as daughters in their homes. Is this assumption of yours correct? And your argument that what right do we have to protest about it? The answer to this is that, not only did we not wish to make women slaves, we also did not wish to make men slaves. If the enemy had agreed to exchange prisoners of war, then we would not have insisted on keeping even one man or woman of theirs with us as a slave. Hence, if slavery remained as a custom for centuries in the world, and if the chaste women of one nation came into the use of another nation by becoming concubines, then this was not because of our view. Rather, those people were responsible for this who for centuries were not agreeable on the adoption of some reasonable and civilized attitude towards the prisoners of war. This statement is somewhat vague. But if we analyze it, then it appears that Maududi wishes to say that if other nations will make concubines of our women, then why should we not make their women concubines? In other words, Islam has no principles of its own. Whatever others do to them, they will do the same back to them. That is, in short, the principle. They will carry out robberies in their area, and so they will also begin to carry out robberies among them. They tell them lies. They will also tell lies to them in return. If they are dishonest with them, then, in response, they will also begin to be dishonest with them. If they tease their passing women or kidnap them, then they will also start teasing their women and will forcibly take them away. If they make their women concubines, then they will also make their women concubines. This will be the principle of life of Muslims and the model of the maslak of life in dealing with other nations. How illuminating are these principles and how lofty is this maslak? This maslak and practice is described as being of that nation whose Allah says to them, "Do not even curse the idols of these mushrikeen lest they also use profanities against your Allah." Those whose Quran commands them. Your enmity with a nation should never incline you to do injustice towards them. You should always do justice towards them. Be just. 5. 8. Never let justice and righteousness be abandoned from your hands. If they descend to despicable conduct, do not forsake your elevated status and descend to their low status. You have been created as a witness on mankind. You have to become a possessor of righteous ethics and a model of eminent character. If you also start committing the same kinds of immoral acts as them in a fury of revenge, then what difference will there remain between them and you? 2.16 The objection. But the criticism of the objector is still there. His stance is that there is no law among the nations of the world today where, after having established sexual relations with female prisoners of war, they can begin to be bought and sold. But according to Maududi's statement, this clause is present within Islamic Shariat. If such circumstances now arise that the women of Muslims are imprisoned by the enemy in some war, and their women are held by the Muslims, and the enemy does not exchange its prisoners, nor releases them by payment of fidya, then in such circumstances, according to the Shariat of Maududi, Muslims will have no option other than to establish sexual relations with these imprisoned women. The objector states that in these circumstances, if the enemy, after the Muslims initiate that which they will enact according to their Shariat, also perpetrates this kind of behavior with Muslim women, then in that situation Muslims will not have the right to protest against this behavior of the enemy. But Maududi did not give any answer to this, even though, according to his line of thinking and the maslak presented by him, its answer was clear, that the laws of Islam are universal. And since the outcome of all the endeavors and efforts of Muslims should be that the laws of Islam should become commonplace everywhere, then if some nation implements that very same law in their land which exists in the system of Shariat of Muslims, then this will be a matter of great rejoicing and a source of immense pride for them. Hence, if some nation of the world, after Muslims initiate it, starts to commit this kind of immoral act with their captive women, then for Maududi and his associates who share the same ideology, this moment will be one for 1,000 celebrations and jubilations because the law of their God is becoming commonplace, and the nations of the world, without becoming Muslim, are starting to follow Islamic laws. In fact, they will call this as evidence of Islam being the deen of fitrat and will say, look, the world has got rid of slavery after so much striving, but since slavery was the demand of human fitrat, therefore these nations had to return to it again. This is how God makes his deen accepted by mankind. How delightful will be that scene in which Muslims will be forcibly spending the night with the women of the enemy. And the enemy will be doing the same with their daughters and daughters-in-law. And there will be drum beats of jubilation and celebration among the Muslims that the deen of Allah is becoming universal. At this point Iblis will gather up his bedding and will go back to Allah, saying that I am no longer required on earth, my objective has been accomplished. 2.17 Now hold your breath. Murtad described the following as being a great favor on concubines. After coming into the use of her master, if a woman gives birth to a child, then she becomes a member of this family. She is termed the mother of the child. Her offspring is viewed as being legitimate and is entitled to inheritance from the father as per Shariat. But whether anyone else is aware of this or not, Murtad himself will certainly know that his Shariat itself has presented a ploy whereby sexual relations with concubines can be established, while the fear that they may bear children is also removed. Now hear what that ploy is. But before hearing this scheme, hearken to a sob from our aching heart. For Tului Islam that occasion is one of severe pain and despair when it has to describe a certain matter which causes the eyes to be lowered in shame when it is presented before the world, and due to which Islam is debased in the eyes of others. Then an even more excruciating occasion is when these kinds of narrations are quoted by being declared to be a hadith. This is because by a hadith it is meant that this narration is being related to the being of Rasulullah, the lofty being of Rasulullah, holder of the stature of the final Nabi, is of such eminence that Allah himself has pronounced him to be Khulq-e Azim and elevated the esteem in which he is held. 140 Hence, for such a thing to even be mentioned in the pages of Tului Islam, as a result of which even the slightest shadow is cast on this eminent being, is an occasion equivalent to the Day of Judgment for us. But what can we do when sometimes the situation becomes such that we have no option other than this? For example, just take the subject of slavery. If we move on at this stage by merely stating that there are certain kinds of shameful things present in our books of a hadith at the very thought of which our forehead breaks out in a sweat, then the mullah will immediately announce that Tului Islam is talking rubbish. The holy hadith of Rasulullah, and these kind of narrations in them, Allah forbid, Allah forbid. Does this brazen liar have no shame that it fabricates such accusations and then vilely attributes them to Rasulullah? Because the population remains ignorant of the narrations in these books of a hadith. And it also seemingly stands to reason that these kinds of shameful matters cannot exist in such holy books, hence this tactic of the mullah becomes effective. This is that point at which we are forced, with a heavy heart, to quote these kinds of examples from those holy books of a hadith, so that readers come to know that this is, in truth, recorded in them. The fact is that Tului Islam has commenced an opposition to the religion of the mullah for this very reason. That because of this religion, Muslims are being disparaged in the world. Islam is being severely tarnished. The torchbearers of Muslims are becoming a target for insult and ridicule among the nations of the world. Such an image of Rasulullah himself is portrayed from which, Allah forbid, the blood of a human being begins to boil, and what is more, such a concept of Allah himself is formed which appears to be a product of man's era of ignorance and savagery. If these kinds of a hadith are ever reproduced in the pages of Tului Islam, which weigh heavily on the refined feelings of the readers, it is only because without quoting them, this matter can never be comprehended, whether the religion which the mullah presents in the name of Islam, is it really the same as that which Tului Islam describes? This is that necessity due to which Tului Islam sometimes has to perform this bitter and unsavory duty. The mullah alleges that Tului Islam receives pleasure from this raking up of dirt. From where can we cast that vision into his eyes through which he could see what great and deep wounds are tearing at our heart? If he could become endowed with this kind of vision from somewhere, then he would be able to see what we are saying and why we are saying it. 2.18 The Hadith of Sahih Bukhari. Bearing these explanations in mind, let us now return to the original topic. We were saying that the Mullah's Shariat has itself proposed a solution for this, that sexual relations can be established with concubines without the resultant risk arising of children being born. Like us, place a heavy stone on your chest and then hear that solution. And after this, bang your head against the wall of the Kaaba, split your head and perish. This hadith is noted in Sahih Bukhari. It is quoted from Abu Sa'id al-Huzri that one day while he was sitting beside Rasulullah, he mentioned to Rasulullah that we have sex with captive women, but we desire that they do not become pregnant because we wish to sell them. Then what is your opinion regarding performing uzl? He replied, is this what you do? There is nothing wrong with you doing this. Because the child which is declared by Allah as going to be born, will certainly be born. Have you perceived from which gathering this image is being drawn? The companions are inquiring and Rasulullah is responding. After this, you can gauge for yourself in what kinds of multiple ways the hypocrites of Ajm have destroyed us. This is that portrait which they have drawn of your beloved messenger and his companions. And today this portrait exists in that book which the mullah presents along with the Quran by declaring it to be just like the Quran. The excerpt quoted above about uzl is not merely passing conversation, this narrative is, in fact, also present in Bukhari. During the time of Rasulullah, we used to practice uzl and the Quran was being revealed. This was that solution which, according to the religion of mullah, used to be adopted for this purpose that concubines should not become pregnant, so that their value is not depreciated in this way. And if even this is followed, or if she is already pregnant, then what should be the form of sexual intercourse? In the same Bukhari, Volume 2. This hadith also exists for this. There is no objection in this either if sexual intercourse is performed with your pregnant concubine in some other place apart from the vagina. Allah forbid. Allah forbid. These are those holy ahadith which are associated with the eminent character of Rasulullah and the great companions. And there is no feeling of shame about what answer they will have in front of Rasulullah and Allah on the Day of Judgment. And these are those ahadith due to which we are being declared as munkar ahadith because we repudiate them. We wish to ask the readers regarding these narrations, do they have the courage to accept that these are, in reality, true ahadith from Rasulullah or Rasulullah's companions? This is, in brief, the maslak regarding concubines and slaves in that system of shariat which Maududi and his cronies are busily engaged in attempting to implement in Pakistan. Just consider that if those laws are implemented in Pakistan which these people declare as being Islamic laws, then what kind of society will be established here, and what will be your status among other nations of the world? We wish to pose this question to every one of those Pakistanis who has any concern for the dignity of Pakistan and feels any pain regarding the image of Islam. Reflect on this issue and then just think, what is the reason for the opposition of Tului Islam to these matters? And on the basis of what crime of Tului Islams do these people who declare it to be kafir and devoid of deen, do so? Remember that these matters also concern you, because, ultimately, you and your future progeny will also have to reside in this country. 2.19 Review. In the previous pages, two important topics have appeared before you. 1. The killing of a Murtad and the second, slaves and concubines. Both of these topics are such that they have a profound connection with the collective system of humankind. Clear and explicit teaching from the Quran regarding these has also been presented to you, and you have seen, 2. What our orthodox religious class says about this. Pay careful attention to these explications. And then decide for yourself, can whatever is being stated before us in the name of Shariat ever be the proclamation of Allah and the action of His true Rasul? The assertion of these people is that since the support of these matters is through our books of Ahadith, therefore, these are precisely in accordance with the Shariat of Islam. In opposition to this, our stance is: the Quran is the book of Allah and it is present with us in its original form, word for word. Allah Himself has taken the responsibility for its protection. No saying or action of Rasulullah can ever be against the Quran. The books of Ahadith were compiled through the individual efforts of people 200 to 300 years after the demise of Rasulullah. And that, too, not from any prior written record, rather derived from word-of-mouth narrations. This is why all kinds of narrations became amassed in these compilations, correct and incorrect. The criterion we now have in order to differentiate between correct and incorrect is that whichever hadith among them is against the Quran, it should be taken to mean that it has been wrongly attributed to Rasulullah. But our orthodox class insists that whatever has appeared in these books of a hadith should be accepted as being accurate, just like the wahi sent down from the direction of Allah. The one who says that there are also wrong narrations among them is a Munkar-e hadith and Munkar-e Shani Risalat. In other words, if there is any such hadith which is against the Quran or because of which an aspersion is cast on the being of Rasulullah, if some individual says about it that it cannot be hadith, then he is a Munkar-e Shani Risalat, and the one who maintains that it is Rasulullah's is in their eyes the one who acknowledges Shani Risalat. In our eyes, this is far from the great eminence of Rasulullah that he will state such a thing, that whichever women fall into your hands during a war, use them, and whenever you wish, sell them on to others. And it is the command of our respected scholars that you will have to accept this, that this is the verdict of Rasulullah. If you do not accept this, then you are a Munkar-e hadith and a Munkar-e Namuzi Risalat. We leave the decision to the readers as to whose maslak in this regard is correct, and if we proclaim to the world that this is the teaching of Islam, then what will the world say about this Islam?